Thank you for that introduction, Tom. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to thank Carolyn Schwartz and the staff at the Eli Library for hosting my lecture. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here today. Today, I'm going to talk about a book I edited called Extremism in America. Beneath the surface of American politics lies a growing extremist subculture. An increasing number of groups across the political spectrum espouse platforms that many people would label extremist. And although most of the groups in this subculture are small, collectively their presence suggests some interesting trends in American politics and society. Now, to some observers, their presence portends the fragmentation of the country. But while to others, they're just another example of American pluralism at work. So political extremism has a long tradition in the United States. There have been numerous radical protest movements, dissident movements that have punctuated American history. In fact, the American Republic was born in revolt against the British Crown. The colonial rebels, they wanted self-government from England, independence from England. Not long after the Revolutionary War, in 1787, Daniel Shays led farmers in a revolt in Springfield, Massachusetts. So several historians cite the anti-Masonic Party of the early 19th century as the first right-wing reactionary movement in America. The anti-Masons were very suspicious of the Freemasons that figured so prominently in the American establishment at that time. A few decades later, there was the Know Nothing movement. This movement arose as a backlash against an influx of largely Irish Catholic immigration. In the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, domestic terrorism reached its apogee in America with the Ku Klux Klan. And at the close of the 19th century, a very robust left-wing movement centered on labor union activism began to take hold. So political extremism has been an enduring feature in American politics. It's really nothing new. Now, although scholars have sought to define the term extremism, there still really is no general consensus on what the term means. But suffice it to say, the term generally has a negative connotation. So extremism can be defined in three ways. In the first case, extremism can be defined statistically, with attitudes toward particular issues arranged on a left-right continuum. The left and right labels originated in the French National Assembly of 1789. In that situation, the radicals sat on the left side of the presiding officer and conservatives sat on the right side. So in this scheme, those people who favor positions on the far left and far right of the continuum would be labeled extremist, whereas those people identifying with positions in the middle would be identified as moderates. Second, extremism can be defined in terms of style. Extremism can be defined in stylistic terms, such as fanaticism, rather than any specific ideological substance. This definition is reminiscent of Eric Hoffer's notion of the true believer, that is to say, someone who is supposed to be totally consumed by his cause. And finally, as the scholar Chris Hewitt once argued, extremism can be understood as being socially defined. As he noted, in any society, at any given time, certain social and political views are considered normal and acceptable, while others are not. So the range of acceptable views may be broad or narrow, and it can change over time. So to characterize someone as extremist is to view that person as holding opinions that are considered to be beyond the pale of acceptable discourse. So what constitutes extremism depends on both public and elite opinions at a particular point in time. So therefore, the concept of extremism is essentially socially constructed. I think the topic of extremism is important today because of several trends going on in America. For instance, the last two presidential elections seem to have had a polarizing effect on American politics. Now, while many Americans took pride in the election of Barack Obama as the nation's first black president, other people seemed resentful for a variety of reasons. Furthermore, the persistence of the economic downturn has contributed to a sense of national trepidation over the direction of the country. On the political right, a variety of activists decrying big government have coalesced under the banner of the Tea Party movement. On the political left, some progressives were disappointed that the Obama administration continued to prosecute the wars in the Middle East. They argued that the war on terror distracts the federal government's focus on solving domestic problems, such as unemployment and health care reform. So a growing chasm appears to be growing among the public on a number of important issues, including things like the proper role of the government, multiculturalism, immigration, abortion, religion in the public sphere, and America's proper position in global affairs. So in such a charged atmosphere, political extremism has the potential to flourish. Here's an outline of the remaining part of my lecture. Numerous extremist subcultures flourish in America today, including small groups on the political far right, the political far left. There are separatist movements such as Black nationalism and Chicano nationalism. There are variants of religious extremism, including radical Islam, Jewish extremism, and the Christian identity movement. There are single-issue movements, including eco-extremism and radical pro-life groups. Not surprisingly, the prison system is an incubator of extremism. And finally, although most extremists are not terrorists, most terrorists have been influenced by extremist subcultures, so I'll discuss extremist terrorism as well. In addition, I'll discuss some signs of convergence in extremist subcultures. The cases of Tamerlan Tsarnaev in America and Dieudonné in France illustrate this trend. And finally, in the conclusion, I'll talk about the implications of some current trends and how they relate to political extremism. So my book endeavors to put these variants of extremism in context. So first, let's look at the extreme right. During the 1990s, the extreme right appeared to gain ground as a social movement, but the movement suffered a series of setbacks in the aftermath of 9/11. Many of the movement's key leaders died or were arrested and prosecuted. But the financial crisis in 2008 and the election of Barack Obama that same year catalyzed the movement. In 2011, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that's a monitoring organization based in Montgomery, Alabama, it announced that the number of so-called hate groups had reached over 1,000. Furthermore, the number of so-called patriot and militia groups topped 800. These were the largest figures ever recorded since the Southern Poverty Law Center began counting such groups in the 1980s. The extreme right exhibits an acute disaffection with the government, the federal government in particular. People in this movement often have a conspiratorial worldview. They tend to look beneath the surface of American politics and find elite cabals at work, subverting society. Finally, the extreme right often espouses an element of racism and anti-Semitism. Now, in recent years, the American extreme right saw an opportunity to ride the new populist wave in the form of the Tea Party. Although less radical, the Tea Party movement echoes some of the same themes as the far right. For example, the Tea Party movement is also very critical and suspicious of the federal government. And many people who identify with the Tea Party voice concern over immigration policy. However, the public representatives of the Tea Party do not use the racialist and extremist rhetoric that is common in the extreme right subculture. Nevertheless, there's a persistent recession. A persistent recession has really brought a substantial increase in unemployment and a decline in life opportunities for many people who were formerly part of the middle class. What's more, uneasiness over immigration could galvanize support for both the white nationalist and patriot segments of the extreme right, insofar as immigration informs other issues that typically resonate with conservative voters, issues such as welfare, health care, and multiculturalism. So, in short, the issues that give rise to the extreme right will become more pronounced in this century. And so, as a consequence, the movement could gain traction despite the formidable opposition arrayed against it. Now, although the demographic profiles of members of the far right and the Tea Party